Okay, so you're looking for some relationship advice, and you've brought us this man's guide to women. They claim to have the secrets to understanding what women really want, and honestly, who wouldn't be curious about that?
It's an interesting mix of research, personal stories, even some humor, which kept me on my toes.
The authors say they're not love gurus, which, let's be honest, is probably a good thing. They describe themselves more as researchers and clinicians who've spent decades observing couples.
Right. And they make a point of saying they've studied both successful and struggling relationships because they believe those who are doing well hold valuable clues that traditional therapy often misses.
I like that. So many relationship resources seem to focus solely on what's going wrong.
Exactly.
Hmm.
So their big idea is that men should approach relationships like exploring a foreign country, learn the customs, the language, to avoid those international incidents, or in this case, maybe ending up in relationship prison. A little dramatic, but I get the point.
Okay, so maybe not the most nuanced metaphor, but understanding where your partner is coming from is never a bad thing. And speaking of getting things wrong, the guide jumps right into the deep end with this claim that trustworthiness is the #1 thing women look for. Seems pretty believable,
Yeah,
right?
it does. And they go beyond just being faithful. They're talking about being reliable, accountable, showing up authentically, basically being someone a woman can truly depend on.
And they tie this back to evolutionary psychology, saying that historically, a woman's safety and well-being really did depend on her partner's reliability.
Think about it. Even in the modern world, feeling safe and secure with your partner is essential. It makes sense that this deep-rooted need for trustworthiness is something you can tap into to strengthen your relationship.
That's a really good point. So how do you actually build that trust? Well, the guide introduces this concept they call attunement, and they even have a catchy acronym for it. AT-tune.
Which stands for attend, turn toward, understand non-defensively, listen, and empathize. It's almost like a roadmap for better communication.
So it's not just about hearing the words, it's about really getting where she's coming from emotionally.
Exactly. They give this example of a woman venting about a friend. Instead of immediately jumping in with solutions, which a lot of us are prone to do, they suggest using the attune approach, asking about her feelings, really listening to understand and validating those emotions. It's about resisting that urge to go into fix-it mode and prioritizing emotional support instead.
It's funny how often we try to fix things before really understanding the problem. I know I'm guilty of that. Speaking of listening, the guide actually says, listening is sexier than talking. A bit bold, but I kind of like it.
And there's a lot of truth to that. Showing genuine interest, asking open-ended questions, and really absorbing those answers can be incredibly attractive.
They even suggest using this on a first date. Encourage men to delve deeper into a woman's responses instead of just going through the motions with those surface-level questions.
It makes sense, right? You're creating space for a genuine connection, showing that you value her thoughts and feelings. And that can be incredibly powerful even on a first date.
Okay, that's all about building connection, but what about that initial spark? The guide dives into physical attraction, and surprise, surprise, they say symmetry is a big deal.
Well, research does show that humans tend to be drawn to symmetrical faces, and this guide highlights those findings. But they also acknowledge that attraction is way more complex than just basic biology. Every woman is unique, with her own preferences. What one woman finds attractive, another might not.
So there's hope for those of us who aren't exactly perfectly symmetrical.
Absolutely. The guide actually says that confidence can be even more attractive than perfect features. They suggest that men can project confidence through their body language. Standing tall, making eye contact, avoiding fidgeting, basically owning your presence.
It's not just about how you look, but how you feel about how you look.
Exactly. And it's not all about looks, period. The guide talks about humor being a sign of intelligence. Women are drawn to passion, to ambition.
So having something interesting to say still matters?
It always does. Those qualities can signal a potential partner's mental agility, their ability to provide. Remember, evolution is still playing a role in our subconscious, even if we're not always aware of it.
Okay, I'm ready for some more of these supposedly scientifically backed dating tips. What else does this guide have to offer?
Well, get ready for this one because it involves pizza. Apparently, the authors are big fans of using pizza analogies, especially when it comes to intimacy.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Pizza and intimacy, go on.
They talk about the difference between just wanting any pizza when you're starving versus savoring a delicious gourmet slice. They're suggesting that quality matters in intimacy too, not just the act itself.
That makes sense, but how do you actually create that kind of quality?
They bring up the work of researcher Meredith Chivers, who found a fascinating difference between physical arousal and genuine desire for sex, especially for women.
So you might think that physical arousal automatically equals wanting sex, but Chivers' research shows that's not always true, especially for women. It's called the discordant effect, and it kind of throws a wrench in the whole men from Mars, women are from Venus's thing.
It does. And the guide argues that the secret to turning that physical interest into genuine desire is all about creating emotional connection and safety. They talk about dopamine, the neurochemical associated with pleasure and anticipation.
So novelty, anticipation, those can actually increase desire.
Exactly. Keep things interesting, build that emotional connection, and don't just rely on the same old routine. They're really emphasizing that intimacy is a two-way street. It's about creating an experience that is both physically and emotionally fulfilling for both partners.
That's good advice for any relationship, really, not just the physical aspect. Speaking of challenges, they don't shy away from talking about conflict, which, let's be honest, is inevitable in any relationship.
So they have a really interesting take on anger. They say men and women often experience and manage anger very differently.
Okay, I've definitely noticed that in my own relationships. Sometimes it feels like we're speaking different languages.
Right. They cite research from Sandra Thomas, who found that women's anger often stems from feelings of powerlessness, injustice, or someone else's irresponsibility. So if a woman is upset, it's often rooted in these deeper issues, and just trying to logic her out of it isn't going to be effective.
That's a good point. It's not always about finding a solution. Sometimes it's about acknowledging the feeling.
Exactly. And on the flip side, they highlight research from Raymond DiGiuseppe showing that men tend to use more direct aggression, while women often express anger indirectly, like through silence or resentment.
Which can be confusing for everyone involved. So how do you actually bridge that communication gap during a conflict?
Well, they talk about this phenomenon called emotional flooding, which they say happens more often to men during arguments.
Emotional flooding, what does that even mean?
Imagine this. You're in an argument, and suddenly your heart's racing. You can't think straight. You just want to fight or flee. That's emotional flooding. The guide says men's physiology is actually wired for this kind of response more often than women. Their heart rates tend to spike higher and faster, triggering that primal fight-or-flight response.
So basically their brains are telling them they're in danger, even if it's just a disagreement about whose turn it is to do the dishes.
Exactly. And when that happens, it makes it nearly impossible to listen, empathize, or problem-solve effectively.
So what can you do about it?
They say that recognizing the signs of emotional flooding is the first step. They actually compare it to a diffuse physiological arousal, or DPA, which basically shuts down all non-essential bodily functions so the body can deal with the perceived threat. It's helpful in actually dangerous situations, but not so much in the middle of an argument.
So recognizing it as a physiological response is key.
Exactly. And this is where they suggest women might have a slight advantage. Apparently, we've evolved to tend and befriend releasing oxytocin during times of stress, which actually helps regulate those emotions.
So we're more likely to seek out support and connection during conflict, while men are more prone to shut down or lash out.
That's what the guide suggests.
Okay, so back to the whole communication breakdown thing. How do you actually have a productive conversation when those four horsemen are rearing their ugly heads?
Well, the guide emphasizes active listening, emotional validation, and creating a sense of safety and security. They stress the importance of investing in the non-conflict time, building a strong foundation of friendship and intimacy that can help buffer against those disagreements.
Like putting money in the emotional bank account so that when those inevitable conflicts arise, you have something to draw on.
Exactly. It's about creating a space where you feel heard and understood, even when you don't see eye to eye.
They also talk about the importance of paying attention to what a woman isn't saying, those nonverbal cues. Trying to understand her underlying needs and fears, which might not always be directly expressed.
It's about going beyond just the words and tuning into the emotional subtext of the conversation, which, let's be honest, can be a challenge sometimes, but it's so worth it.
It sounds like this guide is really big on communication, both verbal and nonverbal.
Definitely. And it goes beyond just romantic relationships. They actually have a whole section dedicated to the importance of female friendships.
Okay, so tell me more about that. What do they say about female friendships?
Well, they dive back into evolutionary psychology, suggesting that women have evolved to form these strong social bonds as a means of survival and support.
It makes sense when you think about it. Having a strong support system can make all the difference,
Right.
especially during challenging times.
Right, and they tie this back to modern-day friendships, even drawing a parallel between female primates grooming each other and women getting their nails done together.
Okay, I have to admit that's a pretty funny comparison.
It is. But the underlying message is spot on. Social connection is crucial for women's well-being. And they cite Shelley Taylor's research on the tend and befriend response, which suggests that women are more likely to seek out social support during times of stress. It all comes back to that oxytocin release, which helps regulate emotions.
So those girls' nights out aren't just frivolous fun. They're practically essential for emotional well-being. I'm sold.
Exactly. It's not just about gossiping and having fun. It's about building each other up and providing that essential support system.
Okay, so we've talked about trust communication, conflict resolution, even female friendships. Where do we go from here? What other relationship wisdom does this guide offer?
Well, they actually break down the stages of love, suggesting that most relationships go through three distinct phases: lust, attraction, and then attachment.
So like starting with that initial spark, then moving into something deeper and more lasting.
Exactly. They argue that lust is primarily driven by hormones. It's that can't get enough of each other feeling, fueled by dopamine, norepinephrine, all those fun chemicals.
Okay, so that explains the initial infatuation phase. But we all know that's not built to last.
Right. And that's where they say the second stage, attraction, comes in. You start to see each other more realistically, evaluating compatibility, building trust, figuring out if you're actually a good fit.
So less about the butterflies, more about building a solid foundation.
Exactly. And they connect this back to evolutionary psychology again,
Mm.
suggesting that on a subconscious level, this stage is about assessing whether your partner would be a good parent.
Interesting. So even if you're not planning on having kids, those instincts are still there influencing our choices.
It's fascinating, right?
Mm.
And finally, they say you reach the attachment phase. This is about creating that deep, lasting bond based on shared values, mutual respect, sense of security.
Moving beyond the initial infatuation into something that can actually weather the storms of life.
Exactly. It's about building a love that can go the distance. And speaking of going the distance, they don't shy away from the big question, how do you know if you found the one?
Okay, so what's their big reveal? What's the secret to knowing?
Well, they put it pretty bluntly. If someone consistently makes you feel insecure, not good enough, or just bad about yourself, they're probably not the right person for you.
That makes sense. Why would you want to be with someone who doesn't make you feel amazing?
Right. But if you feel desired, attractive, funny, all around wonderful when you're with them, well, that's a good sign. They're onto something. With this idea of finding someone who brings out your best self, makes you feel comfortable and safe just being you.
That's what it's all about, right?
Hmm.
Feeling completely at ease and accepted for who you are.
Absolutely. And they talk about the importance of what they call meta-emotion matching, which basically means being on the same page about feelings.
So, like if one person's really emotionally expressive and the other one's more reserved, that could lead to some misunderstandings.
Exactly. They use this analogy of a bed. If the relationship feels like coming home to a warm, cozy bed, that's a good sign.
But if it feels like an icy cold bed with scratchy sheets, it might be time to find a different sleeping arrangement.
Exactly. They also delve into the whole marriage versus cohabitation debate, which always sparks a lot of opinions.
What's their take on it?
Well, they seem to be pro-marriage, suggesting that it leads to a deeper level of commitment and ultimately a longer-lasting relationship.
They present some interesting arguments, like this study they cite where researchers found that cohabiting couples were less likely to support each other during tough times and more likely to leave if a more appealing partner came along.
It's definitely something to think about, though, of course, every situation is unique and there's no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to relationships.
That's true. And to wrap things up, they end with a section on raising a family, emphasizing the importance of dads being actively involved.
They talk about research showing that fathers who are engaged in their children's lives have a huge impact on their emotional, social, even intellectual development.
It's not just about being the provider, but being a present and active participant in their lives.
Exactly. And they even highlight studies that link fatherly playfulness with higher IQ scores in children. So, dads, get in there and play with your kids.
It's good for their brains. Now that's a message I can get behind. So, after this deep dive into the man's guide to women, what are your final thoughts?
You know, It's a mixed bag. Some of it feels a bit outdated, relying on stereotypes or oversimplifying complex issues. But at its core, there's a really valuable message about communication, emotional intelligence, and the importance of building a strong foundation of trust and understanding.
I agree. It's a good reminder that relationships take work and that there's always room for growth and learning. But ultimately, the most important thing is to find what works for you and your partner and to never stop exploring and learning together.
Well said. And you know what else goes well with exploring and learning?
Pizza.
You read my mind. Let's dive into that pepperoni perfection.